Good afternoon. Welcome to this our webinar this afternoon, The Power of Holistic Insights, understanding why real-world treatment in oncology can be suboptimal and what can be done about it. So welcome to our webinar. There will be opportunities during the webinar for you to pose questions and answers, which we'll try to answer at the end. If we run out of time, which is quite likely, we will follow up with answers to you directly. In addition, there's some of the supporting materials to this webinar, the more detailed materials, have been summarized in a point of view white paper, which will be sent to you also following the webinar. So a little bit on the inherent challenges of a single stakeholder view. Traditionally, research into the management and treatment of patients tends to focus on a single stakeholder type, which is typically the physician. But real-world treatment is influenced by multiple stakeholders and a myriad of external factors. You know, some of the current influences beyond the HCP's healthcare professionals' control are on the left-hand side of this slide. Things like patient preference, health technology assessment, access to the drugs and to funding, to reimbursement, affordability, value for money, cost effectiveness, etc. And looking ahead to the right-hand side of this slide, the insight challenge is set to become greater still, thanks to the gradual evolution and incorporation into treatment of innovations with both diagnostic and predictive elements. These include biomarker-informed disease management. So this is the genomics and proteomics side, with companion and complementary diagnostics indicative of disease or treatment response. Then, of course, there's increasing the real-time informed disease management, things like digital health, technologies and wearables. And then we are entering the timing of intelligent, smart disease management, things like advanced analytics, software, algorithms, and artificial intelligence. So I think it's fair to say that as we move to the future, value is increasingly being delivered by multi-component disease management rather than by drugs or interventions in isolation. You're seeing, as I said earlier, the convergence of digital and genomic technologies. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see the biomarkers, the companion and complementary diagnostics. And on the left-hand side, you're seeing the digital, the wearables, the health apps, the interventional disease management, the predictive analytics. As they fuse together, they're starting to lead to improve the efficiency of healthcare and improvements in the economic, clinical, and humanistic outcomes. So in this, in order to understand this increasingly complex, multi-component world, we believe that we must embrace the idea of holism. And you'll see on the slide in the middle there a dictionary definition of holism. In this context, the context of this webinar, holism relates to the incorporation of all relevant stakeholders and the non-human elements of multi-component disease management that you saw on the previous slide. Now, how do we actually develop holistic insight? Well, it need not be difficult or expensive. Much can be achieved through a two-step process. Step one, you build on the strong foundation of tried and tested insight approaches, ensuring, of course, that the study design is appropriate. And in step two, you merge the resulting insights in a meaningful way to generate a more holistic picture on which clear decisions and actions may be based, paying attention to the interrelationships between the components, which is what we refer to as the science of system dynamics. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Ali, who will give us an example from oncology. Over to you, Ali.
Thank you, Chris. Today we will focus on one example in particular from the oncology world, the HER2-negative, HR-positive metastatic breast cancer setting. But please bear in mind that what I will discuss today and what Chris will add after my introduction for this topic applies also to other cancer indications, and it applies also outside the non-oncology area. Here we're looking at the guidelines given by ESMO on how HER2-negative, HR-positive metastatic breast cancer patients should be treated. I would like to point the attention to the top side of this algorithm. The ESMO guidelines suggest that unless a patient have some imminent organ failure, which is called also visceral crisis, patients should be treated with one of the three CDK4/6 inhibitors, palbociclib, ribociclib, or abemaciclib, with hormonal therapy, endocrine therapy. And so, as of today, the CDK4/6 are definitely considered the new standard of care therapy for this type of patients. Moving on to the next slide, Chris, please. So these guidelines that are given by ESMO are echoed also by other national guidelines like ASCO, NCCN. But in reality, then when the physicians sees the patient in consultation, they are not dealing with patients that are extracted from a textbook. They are dealing with real patients. And some treatment decisions might deviate from what are the official recommendations. To understand why there might be some divergence, we need to understand the perspective of different stakeholders that are impacting these real-world therapy choices and the outcomes. So as we will outline in the next slide, we will take into account the view of four different stakeholders: the physician, the patient, the pathologist, and the payer. I'll focus primarily on the physician, patient, and the pathologist, and then Chris will discuss more in detail about the payer's point of view. So to look at the view of physicians, at Ipsos we have extracted data of patient record forms that we have been collecting for more than 20 years across 30 different markets. For this specific exercise, we focus on the U5 and on reported breast cancer patients in the period of between January and March 2022. Specifically for HER2-negative and HR-positive, we were able to extract more than 2,500 patients of the charts, so very robust sample of patients that we could tap into. We noticed that in this case, 60% of first-line metastatic breast cancer HER2-negative HR-positive patients were treated with CDK4/6 agents. The remaining 40% received other classes of drugs, primarily either chemotherapy or hormonal therapy alone. The usage of chemotherapy can be primarily explained because of these visceral crisis that is also highlighted in the ESMO guidelines. A bit more interesting is the usage of endocrine therapy as monotherapy, as opposed to the combination with the CDK4/6. So we looked into the profile of patients reported in our study in the first line setting to understand if there were some clinical differences between patients treated with the CDK4/6 versus those treated with hormonal therapy as alone. And we noticed that patients treated with CDK4/6 are significantly more likely to be younger, fitter, have no comorbidities, have metastases to the bones, to the lungs. All these criteria suggest that physicians prefer to use CDK4/6 inhibitors for patients who are fit enough to sustain a more efficacious but also a bit more toxic type of therapy, but also patients who present with a potentially poorer diagnosis because of the mets that they have. We also look into second-line patients, and we noticed that almost 50% of these second-line patients who received a CDK4/6, and not at first, but in second line of therapy, were receiving an endocrine monotherapy in first line. And this potentially suggests that there is an intent to prescribe the two classes of drugs sequentially rather than as a combination of therapy. And here again, we could speculate a couple of different reasons. Potentially, the fear of toxicity makes them opt for a sequential treatment, or to increase more the overall survival, then some physicians prefer to have an alternative treatment rather than combining both classes of drugs together. There are also some potential other data that we've looked at that can also shed more light on these treatment patterns, which we will see on the next slide. And these are primarily the key reason for prescribing the CDK4/6 versus the endocrine monotherapy. Key reasons for prescribing CDK4/6 are they are considered the key standard of care therapy. They are considered to be more efficacious, and also patient involvement is another key reason for prescribing CDK4/6 versus the endocrine therapy alone. While endocrine therapy is more likely to be prescribed to maintain and improve the quality of life for its tolerability, or also due to the COVID-19 impact. The usage of endocrine therapy in some cases doesn't mean that physicians would not want to use even more the CDK4/6, even for some of these cases. In fact, when we look at the stated future prescribing intent, in 23% of reported patients treated currently with the CDK4/6, physicians mentioned that in the future they would like to increase even further the prescribing of this class of drug, something that didn't occur to the same extent when we looked at the prescribing of endocrine monotherapy. It is really that for a certain type of patients, unfortunately, ideally, CDK4/6 would be the standard of care, but there are some barriers that prevent then the physicians from using what is mentioned in the guidelines. This is a physician's point of view. Moving on to the next slide, and now we will focus a bit more on the patient point of view. Before that, I would like also to mention that there are also new agents that in the future are likely to add more complexity to the overall scenario. Up until now, in terms of hormonal therapy, we had amongst SERDs and SERMs, fulvestrant and tamoxifen. Fulvestrant representing a SERD inhibitor, an estrogen receptor degrader. Tamoxifen representing estrogen receptor modulator. There are a second generation endocrine therapy that now are supposed to be working for longer. Elacestrant is one of them, has been already approved. We have just seen recently positive data from camizestrant, and if these new endocrine therapies are likely to be more efficacious, they might be used more in first line, and the physicians might opt for a CDK4/6 in second line. These are just a couple of examples without even taking into account there are also other classes of drugs that are in development. For instance, we have a new AKT inhibitor, capivasertib, which is currently in trial with fulvestrant in first line. Again, if these two will be approved in first line, CDK4/6 will move towards the second line, and they will have also a knockout effect on all the other compounds that currently are using third and fourth line, and which might shift then to the fourth or the fifth line. All of these to the great benefit of patients, but the complexity also explains why a CDK4/6 might not always be considered a standard of care therapy for first line metastatic patients. Moving on to the next slide. When looking at then the patient point of view, at Ipsos we decided to look into the social intelligence analytic platform, which allowed us to extract publicly available data from online forums. This was generated a wealth of information that combined with our knowledge and experience of oncology and the keywords that are used in cancer treatment allowed us to understand also some key interesting points more from the patient's point of view. In terms of generative words that were primarily used in breast cancer discussions online, we noticed that out of, for instance, the 3 CDK4/6 inhibitors, palbociclib is definitely much more mentioned than the other 2. Palbociclib was the first one to be approved, so it could be that then the first in-class approval generated even more interest and success, let's say, amongst patients. The second interesting point is that on the language that is used by patients, who appears to be comfortable in using technical words like inhibitor, CDK4, and this also suggests the type of conversation that physicians could have with their patients, and in some cases probably they do. In other cases they might underestimate what patients are capable of understanding. Moving on to the next slide. Still focusing on the patient point of view, we were able also to extract a verbatim from forums focusing again on just the topic of breast cancer. And there were 3 key points that suggested, suscitated our interest. The first is the potential divergence between the physicians and patient views. For instance, some patients seem to be better able to tolerate or more willing to tolerate very strong treatments, more than what the physicians might fear. And that links again to the topic that we had before. In some cases, endocrine therapy is prescribed because of its tolerability. In some cases, they could go ahead with the CDK4/6 because patients are willing to take whatever they need to in order to overcome this disease. The second point is on the clarity around the prescribing decisions. For instance, physicians' reason for choosing or for changing a specific therapy are not totally clear for the patient. And the third one is a sort of confusion around the reimbursement and complaints also from patients on the fact that while the national guidelines approve and endorse new drugs, then at local level there are some barriers, some restrictions on what is given, and these restrictions can vary quite significantly from one country to another one, because the criteria that are taken into account are different. For instance, in Germany, quality of life is not a criteria that is taken into account when deciding on what to reimburse and what not to endorse, while in the UK, patients' quality of life is taken into account. This has definitely an effect on the guidelines, which might not take into account the patient's quality of life, but for sure, when then the patient talks to the physicians in consultation, this is a criteria that is taken into account. And this must result in the divergence between the therapy choice in real life versus what the guidelines are suggesting. Moving on to the next slide, we'll focus now on the view of another key stakeholder, the pathologist. The pathologist is that healthcare professional which tests the tissue or the blood of a patient to understand if genetically they are more likely to respond to a certain type of therapy versus another one. One of these tests is the HER2. HER2 is widely endorsed and used already in stage 4 breast cancer. But there are also some other emerging biomarkers that are becoming more and more popular, not used to the same extent yet, but definitely changing the overall scenario. For instance, we have the BRCA testing, we have MSI testing, and if patient result positive to these other mutation, it means that other drugs rather than a CDK4/6 might be the ideal therapy choice to be given to these patients. Patients whose diagnosis and also choice of the therapy might be impacted by a different number of stakeholders, especially in breast cancer, where we don't have only the oncologist. We have, as we see here, the pathologist. We have the surgeon who decides when to give surgery and when to give some cancer therapy drug before or after the surgery. The gynecologist, we have the genetic counselors as well, who provide guidance on inherited mutations and they assess also the familial risk. The third point to take into account is that the patients are not necessarily tested for biomarkers straight away when they are diagnosed, and purposely some of these biomarker testing might be put on hold. Why put on hold? One of the barriers is potentially the cost. And I won't discuss in detail the barriers because Chris will divulgate information about this point in length later on. But the other point that would be worth taking into account is the fact that there are some type of genetic mutation that occur in patients precisely because of the received drug treatments. And to give an example, in breast cancer, we have a new type of genetic mutation, ESR1, which if discovered, if apparent in a patient, then can definitely change the treatment choice, because there are drugs that work only for patients who have this specific type of mutation. Now, in metastatic breast cancer patients, if you have a hormonal therapy, you are much more likely to develop this type of mutation, 24% of patient cases. If you don't have an endocrine therapy, you are much less likely to develop this type of mutation. And so, of course, you might want, for instance, to do certain type of ESR1 testing after you have received the hormonal therapy rather than before. And with this one, I will pass it on again to Chris, who will focus a bit more on the view of payers.
Thank you, Ali. So achieving licensure or marketing authorization approval requires 3 hurdles to be overcome: demonstration of efficacy, safety, and quality. The payer, however, often remains a 4th hurdle to patient access to medicines. And a key payer hurdle to be overcome in many countries is health technology assessment. So it is key that there is a positive recommendation from health technology assessment. And achieving a positive HTA recommendation requires evidence of both clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness. In addition, it's fair to say there are significant differences in evidentiary requirements across agencies and countries. And a lack of relevant evidence can result in a product being licensed but not accessible for use in patients. And it's also worth noting that some European countries take more than twice as long as others to reach HTA decisions to reimburse new cancer drugs following European Medicines Agency approval. So you're seeing a situation across the whole of Europe where different countries may have access or not access at different times to a particular therapy, which would be defined as an optimal treatment for a particular cancer type. And there are various ways of overcoming these challenges, and certainly we're seeing at high political level, national political healthcare policy level, systemic moves towards accelerating access to oncology drugs. We're also seeing moves towards the harmonization of HTA across Europe with the Pan-EU HTA initiative, and also integrating real-world evidence within regulatory and HTA assessment processes, as seen with the EU Darwin initiatives for the coordination of real-world evidence within Europe. In the short term, ways of overcoming barriers do exist. We often see managed entry agreements based on financial or outcomes-based risk sharing. And we also see situations where access is restricted to subpopulations where the greatest levels of clinical and cost effectiveness can be demonstrated. So you end up with a reimbursed population that is somewhat smaller and narrower than your licensed population. So I think it's fair to say, when you look at the world through the payer's eyes, is that access to oncology drugs is increasingly driven by innovative pricing and market access solutions that bridge both drug and biomarker testing. An evidence-based demonstration of codependent value, that's codependency between the RX and the DX, is in an HTA context is critically important for optimal real-world treatment to be delivered. So let's have a look now at the barriers and facilitators of optimal real-world disease management. Firstly, let's have a look at Ipsos has identified 5 key barriers to therapy use. So we're talking about the therapy and not the diagnostic here. So the 5 key barriers are affordability, both of the drug, the availability of the diagnostic testing, the availability of funding or reimbursement, and the availability of data and evidence. The second one is timing, delays in updating treatment guidelines, delays in health technology assessment and implementation, and the time lag in physicians, oncologists adopting technology. There is also a barrier due to preference, influenced by context, personal experience, and outcomes of earlier treatments, policies and priorities. And also the 5th barrier relates to the power struggle between the oncologist, the physician, and the payer, between health technology assessment and the professional medical societies, between the treatment guideline perspective and the different, often different, patient perspective. And as we said, we're talking about codependent value here between the RX and the DX. So we're on the genomics side of the equation. So let's have a look at the 8 barriers to molecular diagnostics being successfully integrated into oncology disease management. The first one, as Ali alluded to earlier on in this webinar, is the one of funding. The next one is the access to and the availability of testing. The third one is testing methods and process. Is it difficult to obtain a sample of the tumor? Is it complex? And critically, how short is the turnaround time? Because there's a long time between taking the biopsy and getting the results. The results will not inform necessarily the physician's therapy choice. Test performance is another barrier. Will the test be, or perceived to be, insufficiently accurate or ambiguous? What about the population selected for testing? Will the population tested be as broad as the drug's indication? Then there's the patient demand for testing and their willingness to be tested. And probably one of the more important ones is what I would call the conversion rate. Will physicians prescribe other drugs despite a positive test result indicating that a particular drug will be the better therapeutic choice? And finally, 4 key areas, which we call the 4 key areas of willingness to do. And first of all, there are 4 key stakeholders: the patients, the physicians, the payers, and the manufacturers. So it's the patient's willingness to be treated. And as I said, that is influenced by patient preference and behaviors driven by experience of outcomes of previous lines of therapy. It's often referred to as prospect theory. Then there's the physicians. Their willingness to test and treat is influenced by treatment guidelines. Their personal experience, for example, clinical trial involvement they may have had. And there may be indirect compliant financial incentives, impact on the physician's income, etc. For the payer, it's the willingness to pay influenced by the incidence of the genetic mutation. If you have to test 100 patients to identify one, that is quite expensive. The cost of therapy and diagnostic testing and the magnitude of the clinical benefit that is demonstrated when you treat with a therapeutic that has been informed by the outcome of a diagnostic for biomarker. And finally, we talked earlier in this webinar about evidence, and we now look at the manufacturers, their willingness to invest in evidence development. Is there likely to be a return on investment in the context of the overall product strategy and their own resource allocation problems? And the extent to which there is sufficient leverage in 3 key areas to result in higher revenues or profitability for them. And those 3 areas are improved competitive position, premium pricing, and earlier use in the treatment pathway. So once the barriers have been identified, we can start to explore options for facilitating their removal. And I'm just going to talk here about the payer perspective as an example. And the facilitators may include actions to promote early access and rapid uptake of innovation, the removal of scientific, systemic, and stakeholder barriers. Money speaks, so creation of incentives to do so may be helped by the modification of healthcare information technology systems, leveraging policy and patient advocacy, collaboration between stakeholders, maybe between manufacturers that are developing a particular drug to fit a genetic mutation. It's in all their interests for the genetic mutation to be tested for. And the final facilitator relates to the integration of data, insights, and evidence from multiple sources. So how do we go around merging and integrating insights? We've done the first thing. We've collected all the insights, as Ali said, from different perspectives. How do we actually merge them and integrate them? Essentially what we've done is we've answered the what, how, and when questions with the basic insight research earlier. And now we need to answer the why. Why is treatment in the real world as it is? And what can a pharmaceutical company do about it? So combining and integrating these insights starts to indicate why current real world treatments and outcomes may be suboptimal. What can be done to influence this? How can we improve clinical outcomes at both the patient and also at the population level? And how can we increase the efficiency and clinical and cost effectiveness of oncology disease management? And here within Ipsos, we use several different methodologies to help develop holistic insight and to merge these insights to help answer these why questions. And here I'll give you an example of some of the methodologies we use. We use modified Porter analysis to explore how the forces of competition, the power of the buyer and the supplier, and the threat of substitutes like generics, biosimilars, influence decisions and outcomes. We use steeple frameworks. So we look at the social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical considerations. We often use the Delphi methodology, which is a structured approach to expert opinion for achieving consensus and highlighting areas of misalignment. We have a behavioral science department. So we look at how behaviors influence decisions and outcomes. And through prospect theory, we look at how experience, uncertainty, and risk change preferences. We look at system dynamics, all to do with understanding the dynamic behaviors of complex systems and the relationship between the component parts. We do wargaming and competitive simulation, experiential methodologies to guide decision-making in a dynamic, competitive, rapidly changing environment. And I deliberately, when I went through this slide, left out the two boxes on the right, multiple data source integration and stakeholder tracking, and I'll look at those now. The first thing to bear in mind is in most situations, you actually have data coming through three different types of source. We have the market insight that comes through proprietary syndicated data, such as the therapy monitors, oncology therapy monitor, and the molecular diagnostics therapy monitor that Ali referred to. We have the data analytics with traditional market research. We have behavioral science, creative labs, and as we heard earlier in this webinar, we have the input from social intelligence analytics. Also out there, we have external third-party sources. We have prescription data. We have electronic medical records. We have healthcare resource utilization. We have claims data. We have all this real-time wearable data, and we have social media data. And then the manufacturers, the pharma companies we're working with, have their own internal data, the customer relationship data, the CRM, and their internal resource allocation. And those are the sort of things that can be brought together to help generate holistic insight via multi-source data integration. The final box on my slide related to tracking and essentially multi-stakeholder tracking. And all too often, tracking is focused on HCPs alone through ATUs because they capture high-level overview of a market or category at a point in time. They provide foundational information essential to the strategic management of a brand. You tend to conduct them as Ipsos does with its ATUs in a repeating schedule every 6 to 12 months, so changes can be monitored over time. And it all seems to focus on brand awareness, trial, and usage of the brand. Now, that's fine, they're very powerful, but it's only one element, one stakeholder element of tracking. In fact, ATUs are powerful, impactful, and becoming increasingly smart and sophisticated. However, in situations of turbulence and market disruption, things like dynamic payer insights tracking can be critical for market understanding and commercial success. So as we move forward, we ask ourselves, we've talked a bit about in this webinar about holistic insight. So which specific oncology business questions can these methodologies help answer? Well, the simple answer is almost all of them. But two examples, I think, are increasingly important today. The first one relates around, and I think you've probably got a clue from this out of what Ali was saying, and that identifying optimal treatment sequencing, exploring the challenges of measuring value along the treatment pathway from diagnosis to death, remission, or cure in oncology, and the role that multi-source data insight, and evidence integration can have in this. So it's treatment sequencing is focus area number 1. And the focus area number 2 relates to attributing value in oncology treatment and exploring how biomarker-informed treatment selection, predictive analytics, and artificial intelligence can result in patients being treated with stacks of drugs, combinations, triples, etc. And then understanding how payers should attribute value to the components, informing willingness to pay and reimbursement, and the trade-offs that manufacturers will need to make in order to for the overall disease management, you recall is multi-component disease management now, to be cost effective, because that is the hurdle that health technology assessment sets. And I think key to this is identifying how payment and reimbursement can be fairly allocated to the individual elements of multi-component disease management, a very important and increasingly important issue in oncology today. So in conclusion, what can we say? Well, I think we talked about the two things we need to understand is why real-world treatment may be suboptimal and what you can do about it. And why real-world treatment may be suboptimal requires the generation of 3 types of insight. There's those systemic and stakeholder insights into the barriers and facilitators or drivers to optimal disease management oncology. There's the experiential insights that we see through competitive simulation, wargaming, and mock negotiations. And there are more holistic insights that can be best explored through multi-source data, insight, and evidence integration. So, and finally, the last slide, I think this is what can be done about it. Well, you can change your frame of reference. You can recognize the codependency of the different elements of the oncology patient's disease management. And you can recognize the importance of treatment sequencing from diagnosis to death or cure. You can access and integrate data and insights from multiple sources involving multiple stakeholders. Patient outcomes are a key metric when defining optimality. And we often see that patient preferences differ fundamentally from physician and payer preferences. So ensure you integrate the voice of the patient into decision making. Third thing you can do about it is demonstrate the codependent value of the RX, the drug, and the DX, the molecular diagnostic testing. Ensure alignment and ensure the alignment of assessment systems, the regulatory licensing system, HTA systems, pricing and reimbursement systems, in recognizing the importance of this codependent value. And finally, in order to really know what you can do about it, you need to remove the barriers to optimal disease management, oncology disease management. As you heard in this webinar, there are the 5 key barriers to successfully integrating a therapy, the 8 key barriers to successfully integrating molecular diagnostics, and there are those 4 key stakeholders where you need to influence their willingness to do. And I'd like to thank you. I think probably we're running out of time for questions. So any questions you have submitted, please, we will follow up with those post-webinar. Please do not hesitate to get in touch. And with that, I'd like to, on behalf of myself and from Ali, to thank you for your time this afternoon. Thank you.